Wow, Sri Lanka's election results talk about a political earthquake, right? I mean, nobody had Anura Kumara Dissanayake pegged as the next president. Did you?
It was a surprise for sure, especially considering everything Sri Lanka's been dealing with lately, the economic crisis, those massive protests, all the political back and forth. It felt like this election was always going to be a big deal, but, well, this really changes things.
It makes you wonder, how does someone go from leading, what, a 3% party to becoming president? Like, who is Anura Kumara Dissanayake?
Well, his story is really intertwined with some of the most turbulent times in Sri Lanka's history. I mean, he didn't come from a political family or anything like that. His parents were farmers. But things took the sharp turn during the government crackdown on the JVP back in '88, the Jananatha Vimukti Peramuna.
Oh, right. That's the radical leftist group. I remember reading in one of these articles they were behind a couple of uprisings, right?
Yeah, you got it. And those events, they really cast a long shadow over Sri Lankan politics, even now. Dissanayake, he actually lost a cousin during that crackdown in '88, someone really close to him. And then just a year later, his family home was burned down because of his ties to the JVP.
God, that's heavy stuff.
It really is. And it obviously had a profound impact on his worldview. He joined the GVP as a young man at a time when, they were considered a serious force, a radical, almost revolutionary movement.
It's interesting, though, because now you hear about the JVP and it's more mainstream, right? Like they're part of the political landscape. So how did that happen, that shift from radical group to, well, more conventional politics?
It was a gradual process for sure. By the late '80s, the JVP was facing intense pressure. They'd suffered heavy losses, and there was a growing sense that, well, armed struggle wasn't the way forward. At the same time, Sri Lanka was moving towards, multi-party democracy. So the JVP saw an opportunity they could enter mainstream politics, contest elections, and work towards their goals peacefully.
So Dissanayake, he was part of this transition from, well, radicalism to a more, I guess, a more conventional political approach.
He was, and he really thrived in this new arena. I mean, he became a member of parliament in 2000 and very quickly got this reputation for being incredibly sharp, very well prepared, someone who, really dug into the policy details and understood those nuances that sometimes get missed.
Yeah, I bet that really resonated with voters, especially those who are just tired of politicians relying on, big speeches and empty promises.
Absolutely. And that analytical approach, that ability to really dissect these complex issues, it became a real hallmark of his style. But even with all of that, his party, the NTP, which kind of emerged from the JVP, they were still pretty small. Like in the 2020 general election, they only got 3% of the vote.
Which, I mean, makes this recent victory even more incredible. It's like going from, I don't know, from underdog to top dog almost overnight. How did he manage such a dramatic, well, turnaround from 3% to the presidency? It's quite a jump. And, one of the articles mentioned that even before the election, Dissanayake was giving off this, I don't know, this air of confidence, like he could sense things shifting. What do you think? Was that just, well, savvy politics or something more?
It's interesting, isn't it? It might point to his ability to really understand the political landscape. Like he could feel that undercurrent of frustration, that desire for change that was building in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, and you can't talk about that without mentioning 2022, right? The era Galaya, those protests, that
Yeah,
was huge, a real sign that people had just, well, they'd had enough.
absolutely. And the Argalai, it went deeper than just the economic crisis. I mean, that
So,
was a huge trigger, obviously. But it felt like the culmination of, years of this deep frustration with corruption, with inequality, with a political class that seemed, I don't know, out of touch, more interested in helping themselves than anyone else.
so how did Disanayak tap into that? His campaign, it must have been very different, right? Not business as usual.
It really was. He presented himself as the opposite of the establishment, speaking directly to that anger, that disillusionment, positioning himself as the outsider, the one who could actually bring about real change.
It wasn't just riding that wave of discontent, though, was it? The articles mention how strategic his campaign was.
You're right. He understood that to actually win, he needed to broaden his appeal, reach beyond that traditional leftist base. So his campaign, it was very grassroots, very focused on connecting with regular Sri Lankans from all walks of life.
So appealing to a wider audience without losing his core supporters. That sounds tricky. How did he manage that balancing act?
Part of it was focusing on issues that resonated across those ideological divides,
Yeah.
like take his promise to modify the IMF bailout, not scrap it entirely. That showed a willingness to be pragmatic, to work within the system while still acknowledging those concerns about the IMF and sometimes their conditions can be pretty tough.
Right. Right. And his personal style probably played a part too, don't you think? He's often described as calm, collected, maybe even a little reserved. It's quite different from, well, from a lot of the big personalities we see in politics.
Definitely. In a political landscape where everything's, bombastic, dramatic, Dissanayake comes across as this breath of fresh air. Calm, emphasizing facts, reasoned arguments. One article I read even quoted an MP describing his leadership style as consultative, clear-headed, and decisive.
All qualities that probably appeal to voters who are just tired of I don't know, the political circus of it all, right?
Exactly. It's a stark contrast. And I think it allowed him to really tap into that desire for, well, for something different, for a leader who seems more interested in solving problems than scoring political points.
So was this a vote for Dissanayake? For what he represents? Or was it more of a protest vote against the status quo? I mean, it's hard to say for sure.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we'll be trying to figure out for a long time. It's probably a bit of both, to be honest.
It is a tough one to call, isn't it? And that kind of leads into the next big question. What happens now? I mean, the articles we read, they didn't exactly sugarcoat it. Dissanayak's got some serious challenges ahead. People are, well, they're desperate for change and their expectations are sky high.
No doubt about it. He's walking into a pressure cooker. And those expectations, they can be a double-edged sword, right? I mean, they give him a mandate, a real push for change, but there's not a lot of room for error. One misstep, even a small one, and that public confidence, it could evaporate pretty quickly.
Yeah, and there are, let's be honest, quite a few potential stumbling blocks. Like, take his promise to modify the IMF bailout. That's a tough one. The IMF, they're not exactly known for, well, for being flexible.
It's a delicate dance, that's for sure. I mean, that bailout is crucial, right? It's going to help stabilize Sri Lanka's economy. So he can't afford to alienate the IMF, but he also needs to show his people that he's fighting for them, not just, doing what he's told by international organizations. How he manages that, how he balances those competing demands, that's going to be a major, major test.
And on top of all of that, you've got the whole issue of governing with, well, a pretty small party in parliament. He's going to need to build alliances, make compromises, and that's never easy, especially when you're trying to bring about some pretty big changes.
It's a huge challenge. And from what I've read, it sounds like he might try to build a broader coalition, some centered around shared economic goals. But even that, that comes with its own risks. He'll be dealing with parties that have their own agendas, their own people to answer to. It's going to require some pretty skillful political maneuvering.
And all of this is happening against this backdrop of, well, geopolitical tensions. I think it was one of the articles that mentioned India's concerns about China's influence in Sri Lanka, which is growing. How does Dissanayake navigate that?
That adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it? Sri Lanka's in a delicate position geographically. He needs to reassure India that he's not just going to, shift Sri Lanka into China's sphere of influence, but at the same time, he's got to avoid anything that Beijing might see as hostile. It's a tough balancing act.
It sounds like he's walking a tightrope on multiple fronts. So for our listener, what's the takeaway here? I mean, this is all fascinating, but it's happening on the other side of the world. So what makes this more than just, a compelling political drama?
Well, what we're seeing in Sri Lanka, it's not an isolated incident. It's part of this larger trend, this global wave of discontent with how things are. We see it everywhere. People are fed up with the usual way of doing politics, with corruption, with inequality, with this feeling that the system, that it's just not working for them. And when that frustration boils over, they're often willing to, to take a chance on something different, someone unexpected, someone like Dissanayake, actually.
So Dissanayak's win, it could have ripple effects, even beyond Sri Lanka's borders.
Absolutely. People are paying attention, especially leftist movements, I think. They're watching Dissanayake. They see him as maybe a potential model for success. If he can actually pull this off, if he can translate this win into real meaningful change for Sri Lanka, well, it could inspire others who are in similar situations in other countries that are, struggling with democracy, with governance, all of those big issues.
So it's a high-stakes situation, that's for sure. No guarantees of success, and it reminds me of other times we've seen this kind of, outsider wins story. Sometimes they really do usher in a new era, but sometimes they collapse under the weight of those expectations we were talking about.
Exactly. Only time will tell what happens in Sri Lanka. But I think it's safe to say the world will be watching. Will Dissanayake deliver on his promises? Can he bring about real change? It's a story of uncertainty, definitely. Challenges for sure. But also, there's a sense of possibility there. And it feels like it's just getting started.
A story definitely worth keeping an eye on then. And on that note, That's our deep dive into Anura Kumara Dissanayake, Sri Lanka's unexpected new president.